The West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is focused on new weapons and training for Ukrainian forces, securing ammunition supplies, and punitive sanctions. There seems to be consensus. The current climate does not allow a negotiated end to the fighting. Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, begs to differ. He's pushing for peace talks and has proposed to act as a mediator himself. He brought that message to the G7 summit in Japan last weekend and hoped to convey it to Ukraine's President Volodomyr Zelensky in person, but Zelensky didn't turn up to a scheduled meeting. Lula later said he was upset about the Ukrainian leader's apparent disinterest in Brazil's position.
It is only possible to discuss peace when Zelensky and Putin want to discuss peace. It is not possible to build a proposal during wartime. What we want is for the war to stop first, the attacks to stop, and we will use dialogue to find a negotiated way out for Ukraine and for Russia.
For more, we can now bring in Oliver Stückel. He's a political analyst and professor at the School of International Relations in Sao Paulo. Mr. Stückel, welcome back to DW. Now, I want to ask you right away, is the West underestimating Lula's capacity to mediate?
Well, Brazil certainly believes it does, because I think there's an often overlooked belief in Brazil that the country has a unique contribution to make to the global conversation. But in general, I would say that due to the at times somewhat controversial comments made by Brazil's president, particularly arguing that Ukraine is as much to blame for the war as Russia, it seems to me that neither Ukraine nor the West would accept Brazil at this stage as a legitimate intermediary. However, I think President Lula has clearly shown that he would like to prioritize this issue. So I think in the coming weeks and months, we will certainly hear more from the Brazilian president about this issue.
Controversial, but also contradictory at times. Can you explain what Brazil's stance on Ukraine really is?
Well, Brazil would like to be neutral and non-aligned. The big question is, what does that actually mean in the case of the war in Ukraine? I mean, what Brazil has tried to do is to preserve ties to both sides. After all, Russia is an important provider of fertilizers to Brazil, which is hugely important to its agribusiness. In addition, there's quite a profound anti-Americanism also in parts of the governing coalition in Brazil, where there's frequent criticism of sort of Western hypocrisy, etc. People asking why the whole world needs to impose sanctions against Russia, while in other cases of violations of sovereignty of other countries, the same reaction hasn't taken place. So I think that the attempt has been made to kind of project Brazil as impartial, but in the end, particularly considering that Russia's foreign minister Lavrov has recently been to Brasilia, and he hasn't been criticized there. He was actually quite at ease. I think the overall perception is that Brazil's position is somewhat closer to Russia than it is to that of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Now, Brazil does, to be fair, have a fairly strong track record when it comes to diplomacy. This one is, I bet you'll agree with me on that one, a tough nut to crack. What would Lula's approach to Putin and this conflict be?
Well, Lula certainly, as I said, prioritizes this, which is somewhat of a surprise because, I mean, there's lots of challenges in Latin America as well. On Wednesday, Lula will organize a regional summit with South American presidents. Lots of trouble here, domestic problems in Peru and Ecuador, a profound crisis in Venezuela, refugee crisis in Central America. So there's lots of issues that Brazil could actually engage on. But I think there's a bit of a sense that Lula and his diplomatic advisor, Celso Amorim, prefer to engage on the global stage rather than the regional stage. And now I think we'll have to wait and see a bit. A lot will depend on domestic stability in Brazil, because unless Lula can sort of rely on a stable political situation at home, he won't have that much time to continue engaging, because if you really want to mediate, that may involve shuttle diplomacy. Brazil is quite far from Russia and Ukraine. So that may involve the president frequently visiting Moscow and in Kiev. So I think it probably won't be Brazil alone. And that's why I think the president has emphasized the need to engage a larger amount of countries like Turkey, perhaps, or India. So I think that will be a bit the idea. But there is an acknowledgement on the part of Brazil that this will be a long-term process and not something that can be solved very quickly.
Yeah, I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier, this double standard as it is perceived in Brazil. How much does this view echo that of other countries in the global south? You know, other countries that might be feeling patronized by the U.S. and its allies?
I think that Brazil's position is not particularly unique in the global south. In fact, I think it is pretty much aligned with much of Latin America or Africa, where there is a sense that you know, part of the negative consequences are actually due to the Western sanctions rather than the war itself. And where some people ask, you know, why did nobody impose sanctions against the United States when they invaded Iraq in 2003? And all these kinds of conversations, I think, are quite prevalent. And in that sense, I think it does also show that Zelensky's message hasn't resonated in the global south as well as it does in Europe and the United States. Yeah. And part of the reason is that Ukraine's diplomacy is very limited when it comes to manpower, while you know, Russian diplomacy is quite present. There are very few embassies of Ukraine in the global south.
We'll have to leave it there. Oliver Stinkel of the School of International Relations in Sao Paulo, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.